Welcome to the walkthrough for Zenith. We are on Mission 9, Persona non grata, and we begin on the first level of this mission, the Vicarane Cove. This is one of the newer maps in the Zenith installation, and so immediately we're presented with a view of the ocean on a thin shoreline on a small island, the inside of which is lush with vegetation. The terrain is consistently rugged and flowing. It has a natural and more sensible feel to it. The nearby lagoon and waterfall make for complementing features of the overall view. Let's contrast this with any of the other previous presentations of outside world terrain in Zenith. In fact, we can go down a list just out of experimental curiosity. For example, in Mission 3, the terrain was not as convincing and was rather awkward in most parts. On some occasions an excuse could be made for cramped terrain, but in most cases it didn't make very much sense, and the old style of terrain building resulted in an unfortunately mild or less than appealing appearance. This was the same case in Mission 5, because Mission 4 didn't really have outside world save for the presentation of the exterior construct. But in Mission 5, as we talked about in the previous video, terrain was poorly developed, and in most cases it didn't blend well with artificial constructs that populated the greater portion of the map space. It was the same with the beginning of Mission 6. However, that was again a presentation, and still yet it didn't look very well, not to mention that the presentation for Mission 6 was subpar in the first place, in conjunction with that terrain. The one exception in terms of terrain in the beta maps that made the cut was Mission 6.2, which provided a more elaborate form of terrain building and did well to present a convincing outside world. That is, it did not it did at least enough for the players not to look at it with a brow raised, sort of an awkward feel to the terrain, as did some of the beta maps, or those that were brought from the beta. And in some cases a lot more, moving towards bumpier and more convincing outside world at the end was displayed at Mission 6.2. In Mission 8 the terrain was inconsistent. In some cases it was convincing, and in others it was excessively sparse, as previously discussed. This has a lot to do with the linear brushes being used as the flooring for the terrain, as opposed to some complex brushes or terrain brushes or tessellation that could be used as a platform for making ruggedness, which is the expectation in the outside world. However, the maps that were made from Mission 9 onwards were different, and chronologically those maps were made in this order. First there was Mission 9, and then 10, then 1, and then 2. So in Mission 9, that we're seeing here, the terrain as previously described was sort of a coming out of the shell for terrain building in Zenith, and I'd imagine that were it to have a sequel or some sort of continuation or offshoot, the outside world maps would have been increasingly more inspired. In Mission 2, the outside world terrain, and from some perspective the cavern terrain in Mission 2.2 and 2.3 was for the most part well developed, and it had a more modern approach to the terrain. In that case, the outside world environment made sense, and strictly in terms of terrain, it was palpable. So another thing you immediately notice is the music and the sounds, which also do well to flow with the visual environment. All these components make for an atmosphere that is not only convincing but enjoyable. In fact, throughout the Vicarane Cove, the level's mood changes going from song to song as you change environments, so as to provide a different palette to the feel of the map as the player goes through the entire level. And by the way, it's not pronounced the Vicarane Cove. It is derived from a Hindi word, so that's why you pronounce it Vicarane. Conceptual grandness is not fully realized or expressed here, but the structure of the map provides a very accurate sense of place in the world, and little else would have been needed to be done in order to provide a realization of the concept of the level in the map. As for the lighting, most of the exterior lighting was decent enough. Perhaps it could have been polished a little bit more, but it wasn't necessary to present the environment. The interior lighting, however, certainly did well to color the environments within the level to certain tastes, and provide hues and shading that almost always provided proper finishing touches to the interiors. This is particularly the case in the elevator event. The dim orange and turquoise lighting that went along with the patterns of the architecture up to the surface was an interesting scene that the player did not expect or tended not to expect. The map has an initial advantage in terms of gameplay because for the most part you're fighting Marines and they are almost always formidable opponents. The mixation of an Unreal bot combat tactics on top of the pawn framework made for a challenging environment and provided challenging scenarios throughout the map. The elevator combat event was a big plus as well, since it usually took the player off their feet. Nobody really expects that Scar Pupae would be so damaging, and the way that the event took place, level after level, it was an interesting little presentation and sort of an allusion to the Unreal Scar fight within Rajagar Mine where you first encounter the Scar. Storyline is not very elaborate throughout the entire, or at least the greater part of the level. In fact, I would say that this level has excessive flux in the sense that the player runs through the entire map at a very consistent pace, and there's never really an opportunity to stop and figure out what's going on, because the map was made to do the contrary. It was made for the player to run through like an adventure, and there isn't really much storyline progression in the map at all, which in most cases would be problematic, but given that the overwhelming portion of Zenith's levels were filled with subplots and events that kept the plot moving, it seems nice to have a map with excellent flux that simply allowed the player to run through the level adventures. And by the way, the ocean scenes were very unique in that few Unreal campaigns had presented environments like that, and it was a nice finishing touch to the ending of the map. Most of the music also in these levels was created by Alexander Brandon and Mikkel Vandenbos, who were also some of the original composers of Unreal and Real Tournament tracks. So now we come to the next level, Mission 9.2, Vector Aquatic Complex. Now, mind you, there are two different ways to finish the map. You could either take the disguise and sneak through the complex, or you could go berserk and fight your way down to the Vector Subaquatic Complex. The latter will be shown in picture-in-picture. And what you do, if you cannot really see it in the latter, is you simply go down to the only hallway you're allowed to go down to once the base is on lockdown and you enter the ventilation shaft. A few comments on the Subaquatic Complex. It's a rather small map, but it's another interesting opportunity for the player to do something different rather than having to go through an otherwise linear progression of the campaign. In that case, it's a somewhat easier level to play through as long as you can survive the lockdown. After that, you're presented with an interesting gameplay event in which you have to avoid the cameras and the detectors as you go through part of the map in order to get to the control room where you can escape to the brig. So this map, Aquatic Complex, is probably one of the most unique maps, not only in Zenith, but in the scope of all Unreal campaigns. Never once really have you had to run through a complex in disguise in Unreal, looking for information, details of your objectives, observing sites where you would otherwise be fighting neck and neck with enemies. And not to mention the amount of detail this level adds to the storyline and the detailing of the subplot. The Marines and workers talking casually, the typical operations of the machinery. To a new player, it feels like they've gone through a complex, seeing people at their daily occupation. The greater purpose of the Aquatic Complex was exploration as opposed to action, which is incredibly rare in Unreal campaigns. There were some passage maps, for example in Operation Apollo, where little happened and they were small, and basically the player simply went through them and enjoyed the scenery. And to some degree this could be said about the passage maps in Unreal. However, never had there really been a fully fledged level wherein the objective was to explore and enjoy the scenery while simultaneously completing the map, not to mention the amount of detail in the map, everything from the brush detail to the size to the content. Now the atmosphere, dominated by a piece by Mikkel van den Bos, but accentuated by the whirs and hums and rumbles of advanced machinery and the feeling of a sleek techno bass, presents a feeling of sort of futuristic underwater bass that the designer desired to present. The visuals do this as well. The reflective floors, the silver white and colored palette which composes most of the environment, over which lie detailing of technology for decoration, provide a convincing and impacting experience. One thing that should be said, though, about the hallways and the lack of interesting places in some parts of the map is that the hallways could have probably been more elaborately designed, and in some cases the locations in the map were either unused or not used to the fullest extent. There was a lot of potential that could have gone into amazing interiors that were reduced to offices or sparse recreational rooms. But there is a definite sense of place as you walk through the complex. The central room provides a very nice view that is for the most part aesthetic yet simplistic, and the underground geothermal plant did a lot for this as well, providing some sense of conceptual grandness, although once more there was a lot of potential that could have gone into more creative locations within the map. There isn't much to say about combat. I mean, once you rescue Silka, all hell breaks loose, and that brings you to the epitome of the combat within the map. The Marines remain formidable opponents, but the gameplay really focuses on exploration. Sometimes the map would seem to go into tangents in the sense that it would bring the player to locations that didn't really provide a great enough impact to substantiate their worth or their existence. And sometimes it was somewhat difficult to figure out where to go within the map. This is one case where the approach in Zenith of building maps as if they were leisurely paintings or architectural scenery did not do well for the flux of the map. But the storyline, however, is elaborated in this map to a generous level. It provides enough explanation to satisfy the explanations to the basic set of events in the end of the campaign, and provides some clues to any potential sequel that may have been realized. Overall, it stands as one of the unique and iconic maps of Zenith for its incredibly unique approach to gameplay and its aesthetic atmosphere. One thing to take notice in terms of the intricacy of events in this level is that this was created prior to the implementation of the instancing and the instancing system, which is exclusive to Zenith but was only ever used in Mission 2. So you could do all sorts of things in this map that ended up causing events to occur. Not to mention that the complex sequence of events which had to occur for other events to occur made for an elaborate map in that sense. Well, let me explain what I mean. So for example, these red lines that you have on this grid display a bidirectional relationship between events on a level. In this case, you're looking at the grid for an original Unreal level, actually the most elaborate one in terms of events, Mish's Bluff Eversmoking. So you can see here that there are a few clusters of event relationships that are sort of tied together that spread out to other clusters. So here is one of the largest maps of Operation Apollo by McLean and Dr. Pest. Notice that in this case there are many relationships, but the clusters of relationships are somewhat sparse. And now here's Zenith's Vector Aquatic Complex. Zenith's event relationships tend to be very intricate and populous. Take, for example, Mission 2.2 or Mission 7. Now, ONP uses a lot more dispatchers, so some relationships would not be shown, and this doesn't necessarily mean that one is eventfully better than the other, in the sense that one is provenly more intricate than the other, but it does show that the complexity of event relationships within these maps are displayed to varying degrees. On the one hand, you have more sparse grids, which imply less intricate and complex relationships in the gameplay events, and on the other hand, you have the contrary.
The stories tell of something, don't they?
Do I look like an archaeologist to you? Contact Dr. Marcus Hume. He's my colleague. He's the one that opened this project. I'm sure with your level 5 access, you'll be able to get in contact with him.
You never answered my question.
Yes. They are separate stories told in fictitious settings. I'm not answering any more questions. If you'll excuse me, I have some particles to shoot.
Look out! Target acquired. Open fire. I need some help over here. I'm in trouble. Attack my target. Open fire.
So now onto the boss fight. This is the second hardest boss fight in the campaign, and on normal mode he does not have his mechanics, so you pretty much just have to damage him down to 0. If you are on heroic mode, however, it's a lot trickier. Every so often he's going to become invincible and damage you over time with poison damage, so you'll probably lose your shield and you have to jump to the top of the platform where you have 2 generators, and basically what those do is they can heal you over time. He'll also teleport to you if he does not see you, and every so often he spawns facades, basically duplicates of himself that disappear after a certain amount of damage. In this case you have to kill the abs as fast as you can, or they will be a huge distraction because they have tons of damage. And after a certain amount of health, he will teleport out, or if you damage him down to 0, he also teleports out. And after that, you can leave the map. In terms of mechanics, it's probably not the most complicated fight in comparison to some of the other boss fights, but the sheer damage and tact of this boss is enough to be incredibly difficult if you're not a good shot and a consistent and skilled dodger. And even in that case, you still have to take advantage of the platforms to get a good grip on the fight.